Today we're going to cover the Aztec Empire. This was another group who originated in the Americas, and as we go through these notes, we're going to see a lot in common with the Maya. Before we talk about the people, we do need to talk about the geography, and the Aztec are going to make the arid valley in central Mexico their home. This is an area with several large, shallow lakes. And around these lakes, you would have fertile land. Now, not only did the Aztec come from this area, but also the people of the city of Teotihuacan and the Toltec. All three of these groups would make Mexico their home. So in looking at this map, this is where Mexico would be today. The area that the Aztec had conquered is that lighter shade of green, and their capital, Tenochtitlan, was located here where we have Lake Texcoco, and they would build their empire from this lake. The earliest people of this region were the people of Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan was a city-state outside of what is today Mexico City. It was around from 100 BCE to about 750 CE. And at its height, at its peak, around 120 to 200,000 people lived there. They had developed trade networks throughout Mexico. They had built around 600 pyramids. We don't know exactly why they disappeared, but we think they were invaded, and that eventually led to their decline. The next group of people to emerge in this region were the Toltec. And these were warlike people who would go on to rule central Mexico. They were around from 900 to 1200 CE. And they created a powerful empire by conquering their enemies. Their capital city was called Tula, and we know that they made human sacrifices to a vicious war god. So here's our Temple of the Sun at the city of Teotihuacan. And when you're looking at it, you might think that you've seen it before. And we have seen similar looking structures. If we looked at the Mayan pyramids, they were similar. But also, if we think about Sumer and the ziggurats, they also created step pyramids that were similar in design. Here we have the remains of a Toltec pyramid. And like our pyramid of Teotihuacan, it was also a step pyramid, and we have a pretty good idea of what it would have looked like back in its heyday. So now we're going to talk about the Aztec, and we'll continue covering them for the rest of the PowerPoint. The Aztec were warlike nomads who roamed the harsh deserts of northern Mexico in the 1200s. And they were such fierce warriors that they became mercenaries to local rulers, meaning they were paid to fight by rulers of other city-states. But according to the legend, the Aztec god of war and the sun told them that they needed to establish their own city. And the Aztec were told to look for a place where they would find an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. And that is where the Aztec would establish their city. They found this eagle on an island on Lake Texcoco, and from there created their capital city of Tenochtitlan, which was established in 1325. And today, Mexico City is actually built over the remains of Tenochtitlan. From there, the Aztec would unify their neighboring city-states into an empire. And actually, going back to that eagle with a snake in its mouth, today that is on the flag of Mexico. Here we have a map of Lake Texcoco, and this would be the site of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And the Aztec would have built around the lake where they have fertile land, but that fertile land didn't go very far. The further you went away from the lake, you would quickly run into desert. The Aztec also built their city on the islands within the lake, and then they made man-made islands to build on as well. So you had a very dense population surrounding the lake. When the Spanish came in and conquered this region, they filled in the lake and ended up building their capital city, Mexico City, on top of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. By 1500 CE, Tenochtitlan had a population around 200 to 400,000, making it larger than London and other European cities. Europe was just coming out of the Middle Ages at this point. The Aztec built chinampas, which are floating artificial islands in the lake, and they were used to create gardens that were floating upon Lake Texcoco. And these gardens allowed the population to grow. It allowed for a higher crop yield every year. They also built causeways. These were three raised roads to connect the island to the outside world. Around the lake, they had small cities, which made this a metropolis. It had a very dense population, lots of people living in a small area of land. And at the heart of Tenochtitlan, you would find palaces, temples, and government buildings. So here we have Tenochtitlan, and it looks like it's floating in the middle of the lake. And some of it actually is. The heart of the city was actually an island, but if you look, you can see little waterways crisscrossing through the green areas. And these are the chinampas. These are the floating islands. And we'll take a closer look at them in our next couple of slides. We also have our causeways. These are land bridges that connected Tenochtitlan to the areas outside of the lake. So once again, the heart of Tenochtitlan was an actual island, and surrounding it we have the chinampas. And some of these chinampas were big and sturdy enough that they could actually build other structures on top of it, sheds and so forth, to store tools and food. To create the chinampas, the floating islands, they would weave pieces of wood together, and these would actually float on top of the lake. Now they would get soil from the bottom of the lake to use to grow their crops, and this soil was going to be incredibly rich. We call that type of soil silt. And it allowed them to grow enough food to sustain such a high population in this area. Because they always had an abundance of silt, water, and lived in a pretty warm climate, they were able to grow continuously season after season. The Aztec would grow stronger by forming the Triple Alliance with the Texcoco and the Tlacopan, and they would grow in strength and number. By 1500, the Aztec controlled an empire over 80,000 square miles, and like many of our large empires that we've talked about this year, they divided it up into provinces, in this case 38 provinces, which made it easier to rule such a vast empire. And we think that there were somewhere between 5 to 15 million people living within the Aztec Empire. Now they went out and conquered new territory in order to collect tribute, kind of like a tax that a weaker nation must pay to a stronger nation. And when they were conquered, these people were loosely controlled. They just needed to pay their tribute. And those who refused to pay the tribute would be slaughtered by the Aztec. In the Aztec social system, the emperor was at the top of the hierarchy. And below him, you would have your nobles. If you were a noble, it meant that you owned land. And by owning land, that gave you power because you were able to use that land to produce food. Nobles were made up of military leaders, priests, and government officials. The highest of those government officials would be a governor of a province and report back to the emperor. Below them would be our commoners, our merchants, our artisans, our farmers, and our soldiers. And the Aztec would actually use merchants as spies. No one would really give a second thought to a merchant who was moving from city-state to city-state, trying to become rich, but they were in fact collecting information for the empire. At the bottom of society, you would have slaves. Slaves were conquered people who would be brought back to the empire and forced to labor. The Aztec religion was based around polytheism, and they worshipped around 1,000 gods. Now, the common people wouldn't need to know all these gods, but the priests would. And they built pyramids to worship the gods. They held public ceremonies to communicate with the gods. People would fill the streets and watch on at the top of these pyramids to see the priests try to talk with the gods. And they would talk with the gods by doing plays, having ritual drama, singing songs and dances to try to keep the gods happy. They also sacrificed humans to their sun god, and these sacrifices were held at the great temple. And they went overboard with these sacrifices compared to our other groups like the Maya or the Inca. Thousands were sacrificed each year. And what they would do is they would lay you out on a slab, a rock, and the priest would be holding a knife above you and plunge it into your chest right below where your rib cage begins. He would reach his hand into your chest cavity, pull out your heart and hold it up so that everyone could see. From there, he would take your heart and put it over an open flame to burn it as sustenance for the gods. And the victims were usually criminals, prisoners of war, and people offered up as tribute. And in fact, the Aztec would go to war in an effort to capture prisoners, which is a lot harder than just trying to kill your enemy. Trying to hurt them enough so that you could bring them back alive, that's a pretty tough thing to do, and that's how serious the Aztec were about making these sacrifices. Here we have the Great Temple of Sun and Rain. This is where the sacrifices would be held at the top of this pyramid. And you can see all the people looking on to watch the day's sacrifices take place. Here we have a depiction of the sacrifice. And if you notice, they're looking up into the sky at the sun because they want to give this sacrifice as nourishment to their sun god. And of course, he's not given a thumbs up. We're just not really good at artwork at this point. Once again in this picture, we see the sun looking on as the sacrifice is taking place. So the Aztec believed that they needed to perform these sacrifices to keep their sun god nourished and ready to fight. What they believed is that when the sun went down in the evening, he would have to do battle against his enemies. And in order to have enough power to fight off his enemies and rise up in the morning, he needed the blood of sacrificial victims. And rather than risk not performing the sacrifices and not having the sun come up, which would lead to the end of their world, they continued on with these sacrifices throughout their time. On the left, we see Aztec warriors, and the best warriors would dress up as different animals. We have our eagle knights and our jaguar knights, and they would be the ones who would bring back the captured enemies to be sacrificed. On the left, we have two victims who were sacrificed, and on the right, we have a knife made out of flint. Now, flint isn't incredibly strong, but you can chip it away and make it very sharp, and that's the instrument that would be used to cut out the victim's heart. The Aztec economy was based on agriculture or farming, and they grew avocados, beans, chili peppers, maize, which is corn, squash, and tomatoes. The Aztec would trade at the marketplace in Tenochtitlan. They used their causeways, which were those land bridges, as well as canoes to bring their goods to the island city in order to trade them. And conquest and tribute would help sustain the Aztec people. When you were conquered, they would want your gold, your maize, your cocoa beans, your cotton, jade, obsidian, and prisoners to be sacrifices or slaves. Aztec science and technology was derived from the Maya, although they weren't quite as proficient as the Maya were. They also created two types of calendars. They had a 360-day solar calendar, which they would use for farming. It was made up of 18 months of 20 days, and they didn't know what to do with the last 5 days, so those 5 days were just considered unlucky at the end of the year. They also created a holy calendar of 13 months with 20 days each, and that would determine which god would show up on each day. They were able to do simple medicine, things like studying broken bones. They were obviously very good at math, especially geometry, to create their pyramids and temples. And artists would adorn pyramids with statues and sculptures glorifying their gods and their leaders. Writers discuss their victories at battle in their works. Here we're looking at the Aztec calendar, which looks very similar to the Mayan calendar. This inner ring would tell us what god would appear on which day, and then the outer ring, that was your solar calendar that would help you to plan when you would farm. Before the Aztec created their empire, when the Toltec ruled, there was a Toltec leader who had told his people to worship a feathered serpent god known as Quetzalcoatl. And his people didn't like that idea. His followers rebelled, and they forced this leader and his followers into exile, meaning they kicked them out of the city. But the Aztec would go on and take Quetzalcoatl as one of their own gods, and they would worship him as well. And according to legend, it said that Quetzalcoatl would return one day and bring peace to the people. And some say that Quetzalcoatl, who looked like a feathered serpent, could also take the form of a pale-skinned, bearded man. More on that in just a bit. This is a depiction of the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. In 1502, Montezuma II would come to power, and it's around this time that we see the decline of the Aztec. Prophets had predicted that terrible things were going to happen to the Aztec. So the Aztec thought that they needed to please the gods and called out for more human sacrifices. They wanted their conquered people to provide more slaves that they could sacrifice. And that didn't go well with their conquered people. We end up seeing revolts in the outlying areas of the empire, and it weakened Aztec control and power. The people were resentful of paying tribute and seeing their young men and women being taken to Tenochtitlan and being sacrificed. The game changer was in 1521 when the Spanish conquistadors, these were conquerors from Europe, they're going to arrive in Mexico, and they were led by a man named Hernan Cortez, who of course was a white man who had a beard. Cortez was welcomed into Tenochtitlan as a god, or at the very least, a messenger of the gods. And from there, it allowed Cortez to have an insight to the defenses of the city of Tenochtitlan. Cortez had already turned some of the Aztecs' conquered people against them, and he would destroy the Aztec Empire through warfare, but mostly disease, as the Aztec were not immune to the diseases that these Europeans brought over to the Americas, such as smallpox. With the fall of the Aztec Empire, it allowed the Spanish to take control of Mexico and, as we see next class, South America, and set up colonies. And from there, they would bring back different crops to Europe, and potatoes, tomatoes, and maize would be three of the main crops they would bring back to Europe. And from Europe and Africa, they would bring new goods to the Americas as well. Big ones being coffee bean, sugarcane, and they also brought over horses. Now, along with those good things that they brought over, they also brought over different diseases which the natives, the Aztec, the Inca, were not prepared to fight against. Their immune system had not been built up. Now, we call this trade network that's established the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, and you guys will go into more detail about that next year in World History 2. But as for us, in our next class, we will cover the Inca and see what's going on in South America.